If you're a fan of the literary arts, you might have heard about the Epic of Gilgamesh. Known as the oldest story ever written by man, this epic tells the story of an ancient king who waged war with none other than death itself. Gilgamesh's story has been passed down through the millennia, and interestingly, it appears that every religion or culture has its interpretation of it. However, it's always been thought that the epic was nothing more than a myth made up for people's amusement. There's a popular saying that art imitates life, and while many always thought the tale of Gilgamesh wasn't true, a recent archaeological discovery has disputed that fact. It would appear that what we have long believed about this god-man might not have been so false after all. So look, I know there have been a lot of discoveries made recently that show our world isn't necessarily what it is. However, this one could easily blow the rest out of the water. It's the type of discovery that will make you hold your head and wonder why no one else is talking about it. But we've got all the details you need to know right here, so join us on this incredible journey to the middle of the desert where we uncover one of the most mind-boggling discoveries ever made in recent times. The year was 2003, the location, the Iraqi desert. Just about a month before the war that decimated the Middle Eastern country, a team of archaeologists and researchers led by Jörg Fassbinder of the Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich made a startling discovery. Deep in the Iraqi desert, Fassbinder and his team discovered a huge network of tombs, which they claimed were essentially inhabited by giant human-like beings. They eventually searched even deeper and found the bodies of other giants that had been dead and buried, supposedly for several millennia, as well as items and artifacts that had belonged to them. Besides all of this, the team reportedly discovered an entire landmass and settlement that had been buried for generations. According to Fassbinder, they found over 10,000 hectares of property and land, many of which appeared to have been described in the Epic of Gilgamesh itself.
Jörg Fassbinder of the Bavarian Department of Historical Monuments in Munich told the BBC's World Services Science and Action program, quote, "I don't want to say definitively that it was the grave of King Gilgamesh, but it looks very similar to that described in the epic. We found just outside the city, an area in the middle of the former Euphrates River, the remains of such a building which could be interpreted as a burial," Mr. Fassbinder said. In the book, Gilgamesh is described as having been buried under the Euphrates.
He also added that they uncovered different Babylonian houses and properties that had been scattered around the area, all of which were buried underground for thousands of years. And now, a few years on, thanks to different whistleblower reports and emails released from top government officials, the truth has finally started to come out. Many believe that the tomb that was actually found was one belonging to Gilgamesh, the ancient king of Uruk. At this point, you probably have a few questions. Why is this discovery important, and what exactly is being hidden from us? Plus, who the heck is Gilgamesh? To understand the impact of this entire story, it's important to go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh itself. Known as one of the first, if not the first, stories ever told, the epic describes the story of the giant godlike king called Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh reportedly lived around 2500 BCE. He was reportedly the son of a Sumerian king and a Mesopotamian goddess. And thanks to his parents' genetic makeup, he was quite literally a god among men. Gilgamesh was said to have been about 17 feet tall, with enough strength to fight a lion and come out without a single scratch on his body. As part of the evidence of his existence, Gilgamesh was actually credited with having built the Great Walls of Uruk, the region which became Iraq today. And considering that the walls themselves are mentioned in the epic, I think it's safe to say there's some fact that Gilgamesh might truly have been a real person. Now, it is worth noting that the Epic of Gilgamesh itself wasn't written while he was alive. It was compiled from various historical records of the king, so it could have been a bit inaccurate. Nevertheless, as the epic goes, Gilgamesh was a despotic king who ruled his people with an iron fist. I mean, for a guy that was 17 feet tall, who knows, maybe his fists were literally made of iron. In any case, Gilgamesh wasn't necessarily loved by his people, and given that he was stronger than anyone else in the land, he could pretty much do whatever he wanted without giving a toss about them. Eventually, Anu, the king of the gods, came along and listened to the prayers of Gilgamesh's people to send them a liberator. So he used raw clay and his own spit to create Enkidu, a wild man who dwelled with the animals and seemingly came out of nowhere with a burning desire to beat the brakes off Gilgamesh. Enkidu eventually made his way to Uruk and challenged Gilgamesh to a duel. Both men had an epic fight that lasted for days on end with nothing less than the fate of the kingdom literally on the line. Eventually, Gilgamesh came out on top in this fight, but for some reason, he chose not to kill Enkidu. I guess he was so impressed that someone could actually take him on for days. On the flip side, Enkidu also became a loyal friend and companion to the king. So just two buds with godlike powers roaming around the world with nothing and no one that could hold them back. What could go wrong, am I right? Well, a lot did go wrong. Gilgamesh and Enkidu got into a lot of trouble, setting out at one point to the cedar forest beyond the 7th mountain range. Their goal was to claim the mountain range for Gilgamesh and increase his influence. While there, the two met Humbabar, a monster with the face of a lion that protected the general wildlife there. Through some cunning and brute force, Gilgamesh and Enkidu murdered Humbabar, claiming his land. But while this caused a bit of an uproar among the inhabitants, our boys didn't care. Gilgamesh and Enkidu eventually went far enough when Ishtar, the Mesopotamian goddess of love and justice, reportedly tried to seduce Gilgamesh. The king rebuffed and scorned her, and she asked her parents Anu and Antu to give her the bull of heaven. Ishtar set the bull loose, charging it to kill her would-be lover, but once again Gilgamesh and Enkidu proved to be just too much of a match. The two men tag-teamed on the bull, with Enkidu holding his tail and Gilgamesh stabbing it in the neck. Enkidu eventually tore off the bull's limbs and hurled it at Ishtar. This, according to the gods, was a step too far. They sentenced Enkidu to death, with the wild man falling severely ill and eventually dying. Gilgamesh was crushed by his best friend's death. He reportedly didn't even want to believe that Enkidu was dead until he saw maggots coming out of the latter's nose. Grief-stricken, Gilgamesh spared no expense in mourning and burying his friend. It wasn't just the fact that Enkidu had died that traumatized Gilgamesh. He had suddenly been faced with his own mortality, as well as the fact that he would also die one day. Determined to find the secret of eternal life, Gilgamesh left Uruk to seek out Utnapishtim, a man whose name literally translated to the far away. Utnapishtim had been the lone survivor of a terrible flood that a god had sent to his homeland of Babylon. According to the story, he had been tasked by the god in question to create a massive ship called the Preserver of Life that would help him survive the flood, and he did. Gilgamesh was convinced Utnapishtim would know how to avoid death and guide him. He had to cross some pretty crazy obstacles to get there, including the Twin Peaks at the end of the earth, a tunnel guarded by two giant scorpions, and even the waters of death, but reach Utnapishtim he did. When the two men met, Utnapishtim reprimanded Gilgamesh for all he had done, but he also explained how he was able to build the Preserver of Life. Utnapishtim explained that the god who told him to build the vessel gave him specific details and asked that he take 2 of every animal he could find. Sound like the story of Noah from the Bible, anyone? Essentially, Utnapishtim was granted eternal life by the gods for his actions, so he didn't have much to offer Gilgamesh. The king was unconvinced, however, so Utnapishtim told him that he could help him if he went a week without sleeping. But try as he did, Gilgamesh just couldn't conquer sleep, showing that he wasn't worthy. Nevertheless, Utnapishtim pitied him and told him of a magical plant that could renew his youth at the bottom of the waters of death. Gilgamesh bound stones to his feet and immediately jumped into the sea. He obtained the plant, but while he bathed, a serpent stole it, and with it, Gilgamesh's last hope for immortality. Devastated, Gilgamesh returned home. The king spent his last days as a relatively peaceful man, showing that the trip he took kind of changed him. He eventually died in Uruk, with his body being buried at the site allegedly discovered by Fassbind and his team. So now we understand the epic of Gilgamesh and who he was. While scholars continue to dispute whether or not he existed, the fact that Fassbinder and his team discovered this interesting site has raised a lot of eyebrows. Was it really the grave of Gilgamesh, or was it just some other grave site that might not necessarily be as historically relevant as Gilgamesh? For Fassbinder, the man who initially found this area, there was no doubt about the fact that this was the grave of Gilgamesh. Shortly after the grave was discovered, he spoke to the BBC outlining everything that they had found and how significant it all was. Fassbinder also added that